Hello everyone, thank you for being here today. I'm truly excited to share this moment with you. Let's sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey together. Today, I want to tell you about a truly remarkable person, Nelson Mandela. He was not only a leader but also a symbol of courage, forgiveness, and hope. Born in South Africa, Mandela dedicated his life to fighting against racial injustice and inequality under the harsh system of apartheid. Despite spending 27 years in prison, he never gave up his dream of a free and united nation. His strength came from his belief in peace, reconciliation, and the power of humanity. When he finally became the first black president of South Africa, he showed the world that even the darkest past can lead to a brighter future if we choose love over hate. Mandela's story is not just history, it is a lesson of resilience and compassion that continues to inspire millions of people across the globe. Chapter 1: The Seeds of a Giant. The rolling hills of the Eastern Cape in South Africa carried the whispers of ancient stories. It was here, in the small village of Mvizo, that a child named Rolihlahla Mandela was born on July 18, 1918. His very name, Nkosi, meant troublemaker, a playful prediction of the storm he would one day bring against injustice. Yet on the day of his birth, no one could have imagined that this boy, born to the Thembu royal family but raised in humble surroundings, would grow to embody the spirit of an entire nation. Mandela's father, Gadla Henry Mfakeni-Iswa, was a respected chief who believed in tradition, honor, and dignity. From him, young Rolihlahla inherited a quiet but unshakable pride. His mother, Nosekeni Fanny, was gentle and deeply spiritual, teaching him compassion and the value of community. Around the family fire, he listened to elders recount tales of warriors who fought with courage and wisdom, shaping his young mind with the notion that leadership was service, not power. At the age of 7, Mandela attended a Methodist school, where a teacher, following colonial custom, gave him the English name Nelson. This act, small on the surface, marked the beginning of his encounter with a world shaped by foreign domination and inequality. The boy who had once run barefoot through the valleys now wore a Western name, a symbol of the broader struggle between African identity and colonial rule. Even as a child, Mandela carried himself differently. He was curious, thoughtful, and restless. He absorbed lessons not only from books but also from the land around him. He learned resilience from the harsh African sun, patience from watching cattle graze, and discipline from the strict traditions of his people. These were not just childhood experiences. They were seeds of the leader he would become. When his father died, Mandela's life shifted. The loss was devastating, but it also opened a door. He was sent to live with Chief John Jintaba Dalindyebo, the regent of the Thembu people, who promised to care for him as his own son. In the royal household, Mandela was exposed to leadership and governance at an early age. He observed the chief settle disputes, not with force, but with reason and fairness. Mandela watched, listened, and absorbed. Each lesson carved deeper into him the conviction that true power came not from fear, but from justice. Though still just a boy, he began to feel a fire stirring within him. It was not yet the blaze of revolution, but a quiet spark, the sense that his life was not entirely his own, but bound to the destiny of his people. In those formative years, Mandela's path was being carved silently by history itself. He did not yet know the prisons that awaited him, the decades of sacrifice, or the cheers of freedom that would one day echo his name across continents. But he knew this: he belonged to something greater than himself. And so, the child named Troublemaker began his journey toward becoming a man who would trouble the foundations of injustice, and inspire the world. Chapter 2: The Path of Learning. The boy who once herded cattle in Kunu now found himself walking into classrooms that smelled of chalk and ambition. Nelson Mandela's education began in humble settings, yet each step took him closer to a destiny neither he nor his teachers could yet imagine. At Heldtown, a strict Methodist institution, discipline was as much a part of life as prayer. The young Mandela absorbed not only knowledge from books but also lessons about perseverance, humility, and the dignity of service. Education became his window to a wider world. He read about great leaders and philosophers, men who had shaped nations and ideas. Their stories planted in him a belief that leadership was not born of privilege alone but forged through courage, sacrifice, and vision. For Mandela, every word he read seemed to whisper that change was possible, even in a land divided by race and oppression. But the young scholar was not only molded by textbooks. Tradition still held his heart. In the evenings, back home, he joined in the communal gatherings of his people, listening to debates about tribal customs, justice, and governance. He learned that every voice mattered, even the quietest. These circles of dialogue foreshadowed the democratic ideals that would later guide his struggle for freedom. When he entered the University of Fort Hare, Mandela was among the small, fortunate group of black South Africans allowed access to higher education. The campus buzzed with youthful energy and dreams of a different future. For the first time, Mandela encountered peers who were equally ambitious, equally restless. Here, he studied law and politics, sharpening his mind into a tool for change. But he also discovered something deeper: his own voice. At Fort Hare, he joined debates, argued fiercely, and challenged ideas. He was no longer the quiet observer from the chief's court; he was becoming a man who could stand tall before others and speak with conviction. Yet, with growth came conflict. When students organized a protest against the administration's policies, Mandela stood among them. His refusal to back down cost him dearly; he was expelled. That moment of loss, however, became a turning point. Mandela realized that true learning did not only take place within the walls of a university. It was in the streets, the courts, and the struggles of ordinary people that he would find his greatest lessons. Returning home, he was met with expectations from his guardian, Chief John Jintaba. Plans were being made for Mandela to marry and settle into the life of a traditional leader. But in his heart, Mandela felt the pull of a different calling, one not confined to the boundaries of tribe or custom, but one that stretched toward the liberation of an entire people. It was this tension, between tradition and progress, obedience and defiance, that set him on the next stage of his journey. The young man, once expelled for speaking out, now carried within him a quiet but unshakable resolve: he would dedicate his life to the pursuit of justice. The boy was becoming a leader, and the leader was becoming a symbol. Chapter 3: The Fire of Resistance. Johannesburg in the 1940s was a city alive with contradictions. Gleaming trams clattered past the crowded streets of Alexandra Township, where families lived in cramped shacks, their lives hemmed in by poverty and laws that told them where they could and could not go. To the young Nelson Mandela, newly arrived from the countryside, it was both overwhelming and awakening. He came with little more than hope and determination. Taking small jobs as a law clerk, Mandela quickly learned the daily humiliations that black South Africans endured. He watched men carry passbooks like chains, forced to present them at any moment to police officers who wielded their authority with cruelty. He listened to women describe how their families were torn apart by unjust labor laws. These were not abstract injustices in a textbook, they were wounds etched on the lives of people he saw every day. Johannesburg hardened him, but it also sharpened his vision. At night, in dimly lit rooms filled with smoke and urgency, Mandela began to meet others who shared his hunger for justice. He encountered activists, thinkers, and dreamers who spoke of resistance, of unity, and of a South Africa that could one day belong to all who lived in it. Among them, he found brotherhood and purpose. Law became his weapon. With Oliver Tambo, his lifelong friend, Mandela established South Africa's first black-owned law firm. Their office was small and often crowded with clients seeking help against the injustices of the apartheid system. For many who came through the door, Mandela's voice was the first to tell them, "You are not powerless." He defended those who had no one else to stand for them, not only with legal arguments but with the conviction that their dignity mattered. Yet Mandela's fight could not remain confined to the courtroom. The tightening grip of apartheid demanded more. In 1944, he joined the African National Congress, ANC, a political organization that had long sought to challenge racial injustice. But Mandela and his peers, young, restless, unyielding, believed the ANC needed new energy. Together, they formed the ANC Youth League, a force that insisted on bold action rather than cautious petitions. For Mandela, activism was not a choice but an obligation. He marched in protests, organized boycotts, and gave speeches that stirred hope and defiance. His words were fire. The struggle is my life. Even in the face of arrests, police brutality, and constant surveillance, he refused to bow. Each act of resistance strengthened his belief that freedom was worth any sacrifice. But resistance came at a personal cost. The young lawyer, once focused on building a stable career, now lived with the risk of imprisonment. His family life grew strained as he dedicated more and more of himself to the cause. Mandela knew the road ahead would be painful, but he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. In the heart of Johannesburg, amidst the shadows of oppression, Nelson Mandela's fire was lit. It was a fire that would spread from the streets of townships to the halls of government, from the prisons of Robben Island to the world beyond. The boy from Kunu had become not just a lawyer, not just a protester, but a leader of a movement that could no longer be silenced. Chapter 4: Behind the Iron Bars. The year was 1964, and the courtroom in Pretoria was heavy with silence. Nelson Mandela stood tall in the dock, his voice steady as he delivered words that would echo through history, "I am prepared to die." With those words, he declared his unbreakable devotion to the cause of freedom, even as the state prepared to silence him. The Rivonia trial ended with a life sentence, not execution, but in many ways, prison was meant to be a slower kind of death. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a barren fortress surrounded by cold waters. The cell assigned to him was small, barely large enough for a bedroll and bucket. Days began before sunrise, filled with backbreaking labor in a limestone quarry under the relentless African sun. Guards barked orders, their intent clear, to strip the prisoners of dignity, to reduce them to shadows of men. But Mandela refused to bend. The quarry became more than punishment, it became a classroom. Prisoners shared ideas, debated politics, and educated one another in secret. Mandela himself taught lessons in law and history, reminding his fellow inmates that their minds remained free, even if their bodies were chained. In whispers and coded notes, Robben Island transformed into what many would later call a university of resistance. Life behind bars tested him deeply. Letters from home were censored or delayed. His children grew up without their father, and his marriage strained under the burden of separation. At times, loneliness pressed on him like the walls of his cell. Yet even in solitude, Mandela nurtured a quiet strength. He studied his jailers, learning their fears and humanity. Instead of hatred, he chose discipline. He trained his body with exercise and his spirit with patience, understanding that the struggle was not only against a system but also against despair. Over the years, his fellow prisoners began to see Mandela not only as a comrade but as a moral anchor. He carried himself with dignity, even in chains, and demanded the same respect for others. When food was poor, he argued for better rations. When guards treated inmates cruelly, he stood firm against the injustice. Slowly, he transformed the very prison meant to break him into a symbol of resilience. Outside the prison walls, the world was changing. International pressure against apartheid grew stronger, and Mandela's name became a rallying cry. Posters, chants, and songs spread across continents, "Free Nelson Mandela." Though he could not hear them, he knew the struggle continued, and that gave him strength. Decades passed. Seasons changed on Robben Island, but Mandela's resolve did not. He entered prison as a fiery young revolutionary. He would emerge, after 27 long years, as a statesman tempered by suffering, patience, and vision. The bars that confined him could not contain the dream he carried. Behind iron bars, Nelson Mandela forged the spirit that would one day lead South Africa into freedom. Chapter 5: Freedom's Dawn. On the morning of February 11, 1990, the gates of Victor Verster prison swung open. A tall, gray-haired man stepped into the sunlight, his fist raised high. After 27 years of confinement, Nelson Mandela was free. The crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers, tears streaming down their faces. Around the world, millions watched the live broadcast. It was not merely the release of a prisoner, it was the rebirth of hope. Mandela's walk to freedom was measured, calm, almost regal, the years in prison had not broken him, they had refined him. He carried himself not with bitterness but with dignity. Reporters shouted questions, supporters surged forward, and yet his presence brought stillness. People saw not a man released from chains but a leader ready to carry the weight of a nation. South Africa was on the brink, apartheid still stood, though cracks had begun to show. The country was divided, violence erupted in townships, and distrust ran deep. Many feared civil war. Mandela, however, emerged with a vision not of revenge but of reconciliation. "We must build a rainbow nation," he declared, "where all South Africans can walk tall, without fear, without hatred, without discrimination." His message was radical in its simplicity: forgiveness. He knew that to heal the wounds of apartheid, South Africa needed more than justice, it needed unity. While others called for retribution, Mandela extended a hand to his former oppressors. He met with government officials, including President F.W.de Klerk, and pushed for negotiations that would dismantle apartheid peacefully. It was not easy. Each step forward was met with suspicion, resistance, and outbreaks of violence, but Mandela's calm authority guided the process. In the months after his release, he traveled tirelessly, speaking to crowds across the country. His speeches were filled with hope, yet he did not hide the challenges ahead. He reminded his people that freedom was not a gift but a responsibility, demanding discipline, tolerance, and hard work. His words lit a fire in the hearts of millions who had long lived in the shadows of oppression. On April 27, 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. Lines of voters stretched for miles, many casting a ballot for the very first time. The moment was electric, a nation choosing its destiny. When the results came, Nelson Mandela was elected as South Africa's first black president. It was more than a political victory, it was the triumph of humanity over hate. As he stood before the world at his inauguration, Mandela's voice carried the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will experience the oppression of one by another. The prisoner had become a president, the man who had once been silenced now spoke for a nation reborn. And though the challenges ahead were immense, South Africa had taken its first steps into freedom, guided by the unshakable spirit of Nelson Mandela. Chapter 6: The Legacy of a Giant. The Union buildings in Pretoria stood bathed in sunlight as Nelson Mandela, now President of South Africa, looked out over the vast crowds gathered in celebration. He was 75 years old, but his stride was steady, his smile unwavering. The man who had walked free from prison only a few years before was now entrusted with leading a nation through its most delicate rebirth. Mandela's presidency was not the end of his struggle but the beginning of a new challenge, to transform South Africa from a land divided by hatred into a home of unity. He believed reconciliation was the key. Instead of seeking revenge, he invited his former enemies to join in building the future. He wore the green and gold jersey of the Springboks, the once-hated symbol of white South Africa, during the 1995 Rugby World Cup. When South Africa won, the image of Mandela celebrating with the team became a moment of national healing. It was proof that sports, like leadership, could unite rather than divide. His government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, where victims and perpetrators of apartheid could speak openly. It was not about erasing pain but about acknowledging it. Mandela believed that forgiveness was not weakness, it was the highest form of courage. Through these efforts, South Africa began to stitch together its torn fabric, though scars remained. As president, he lived simply, refusing to let power change him. He insisted on serving only one term, setting an example of humility in a world where leaders often clung to office. He spoke often of children, of education, and of a future where every South African, black or white, rich or poor, could dream without fear. When he stepped down in 1999, Mandela did not retire into silence. Instead, he became a global elder statesman, a voice for peace and human dignity. He campaigned against HIV/AIDS, advocated for the rights of the poor, and urged nations to choose dialogue over war. His presence alone carried weight. When Mandela spoke, the world listened. In his later years, as age slowed his steps, his influence only grew stronger. To many, he was more than a politician, he was a symbol of endurance, compassion, and moral clarity. He reminded the world that even in the darkest of times, humanity could choose light. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. The news spread like a wave across the globe, leaders wept, citizens sang, and nations lowered their flags. Yet amid the grief, there was also celebration, a recognition that his life had been a gift not just to South Africa but to all humankind. Today, Mandela's legacy lives on wherever people rise against injustice, wherever forgiveness triumphs over hatred, and wherever hope refuses to die. He was once a boy called Troublemaker. He became a prisoner, a president, and finally, a legend. Nelson Mandela's story reminds us that courage can change nations, and compassion can heal the world. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below to let us know what content you'd love to see next.